Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm your host, Mark Graben. Our guest today is Mike Chaput. He is president and CEO of Endsight. He bought his first company at age 24, later rebuilt from that early failure and went on to grow a business to 35 million in revenue and 140 employees. So he now leads Endsight and advises other high growth companies, bringing a practical perspective on leadership, culture, and sustainable growth. So, Mike, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on, Mark, and thanks to your listeners for their time and attention on this podcast. Looking forward to talking to everybody.
Yeah, I'm glad we're all here together, and there's a lot we're going to dig into later about leadership and culture and some shared perspectives we have. Maybe we'll find some differences to debate and discuss in the name of a good conversation here. But as we always do on the show, of course, we're going to dive into the first question. I don't know if this is going to connect to something from your bio or a different story, but Mike, what's your favorite mistake?
Yeah, well, so it's kind of funny, everybody wants, I went bankrupt when I was 28. So everybody wants me to talk about that, which I'm happy to do. It was a good learning experience, but it's actually, a lot of the mistakes that I made that led to that were, I don't know, they were inside of the decisions that we made when we bought the company. They were very hard to learn from. Don't make bad deals is kind of the
Yeah.
yeah. Don't
The
be
high
really
level, the high
don't
level story.
don't be a really naive kid and jump into water that's, too deep for you to swim in, something like that.
Yeah.
But not so much to learn. So I wanted to take a different direction, actually talk about my business insight.
Mhm.
So I'm writing a book. I do some public speaking. And my belief, the thing I'm trying to get out there is I think the job of a CEO is really along two domains, the right hand and the left hand, so to speak. And on the left hand side, let's say, or the right hand, it doesn't matter which one, but on
Yeah.
the left hand side, let's just call it vision. And so I think the CEO needs to paint a picture of a future state,
Mhm.
and it needs to be compelling, and it needs to be clear, and it needs to have the requisite detail, and they need to get alignment on it. And that's like the first domain. And the second domain, I'll call it the domain. I kind of want to call it the domain of spirit. You've heard it called like the CEO
Mhm.
is a spiritual leader, but it's really the domain of values. It's the
Mm.
behavioral
Mhm.
norms that, if followed, would manifest the vision. So you think about it like, hey, if I could structure the behavioral norms in a perfect way where if I could snap a finger and everybody just did those things, my vision would manifest. Okay, so they got
Yeah,
vision and values.
sure.
And I think it's really important for the leader to get this right, because when they get those two elements right, I think they kind of summon, I call it, they summon the spirit animal of a predator. They
Mm.
put their team into goal seeking land. They get their team acting on the dopaminergic system where that's where your feel good chemistry and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Get it out of limbic land where people are fear and anxiety and all that kind of stuff. And work becomes better. I actually even think that if you can align people on goals, it's the fundamental basis for community because they see each other as
Mhm.
collaborators towards the goal. Typically, when you see things like factions and that kind of stuff, it's because people don't think they share the same goal. So if a leader gets those things right, I think they can really set their organization up well. So my favorite mistake is actually in my own experience on the domain of values. And I can kind of set this up by saying that being 24 and being thrust into a CEO role, when I became a CEO, I hadn't managed a human being. I didn't really know how to read a financial report very well, if at all. I hadn't sold a deal really. I mean, that was
Yeah.
like, if you took a list of all the things that you need to be able to do to run a business, I hadn't done any of them.
Mhm.
And so, I was in my desperation, I read everything I could get my hands on. And I just constantly read. I was commuting, so I was doing Audible. Actually, it was audio CDs at the time. I was doing audio
Okay.
CDs at the time, putting books in. And I read the first time I heard about values, it was actually in Jim Collins with Jerry Porras's book, Built to Last.
Mhm.
And then, of course, it came up again in several other texts. I mean, it's pretty much everybody knows this. And it took me a really long time to get kind of past even more critical bottlenecks, error, like selling deals and all that kind of stuff before I could really pay attention to values. When we started Insight, I knew we had taken
And
on.
Sorry to interrupt, but how much later did you start Endsight?
So, yeah, to give the kind of the timeline, I was 24. That was 2000. We ran the first company, which was called PCS Networks. We ran that from 2000 to 2004. That went up bankrupt. We started Endsight in 2004.
Okay.
And so it's, it's been a minute. Insight's a
Mhm.
fairly mature organization now with hundreds of customers and, 140 employees and 35 million in revenue. But at the time when we started it, it was me and three co-founders and like two or three other people, that we knew from the first company. It was nothing.
Yeah.
It was a dust. But we decided that we wanted to establish values. And I had met Vern Harnish
Mm.
in EO. I was member of entrepreneurs organization. It was called YEO back then. And Vern actually came and spoke. And I actually have a signed copy of his book, Rockefeller Habits.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is I kind of thought he was a hack when he spoke. I thought he was just kind of stealing other people's ideas.
Mhm.
But then I read the book and I thought, "Oh, man, this is pretty good." It's like an instruction manual on how to create a vision, basically, which he calls the one-page business plan, and it's like a
Mhm.
form you fill out. So my partners and I decided we wanted to do that, and we struggled mightily. We couldn't figure out, we couldn't align on the values. We couldn't figure out what the values should be. We didn't know what good values looked like. We had no idea how
Mm.
to determine a purpose. We were in survival mode, so it was very difficult for us to think about some kind of existential purpose when you're just like
Sure.
trying to pay your bills and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So there was all these kind of problems that we had, but we came up with what we thought were good values at the time. And um, there were four values. One of them was like do the right thing for the customer. We had an intuition that that if you if you took care of your customers, things would be good. We
Mhm.
had this value that was called take pride in your work and don't cut corners. That had problems too. I can tell you why that was um, problematic. One was take the long view. That's actually
Mhm.
pretty good. Still kind of part of our domain of values. But my favorite one, the favorite mistake, so to speak, was this
Mhm.
value that we had. It was called have a sense of humor and take enjoyment from the day. Now, even as I say it, it
It
sounds pretty
I
good. Like it
it
sounds
doesn't
like a
sound
place I want to
problematic.
work,
Right.
which is why it's my favorite mistake because I didn't understand why that fundamentally, let's say, wouldn't manifest the vision. So, when I talked at the beginning, like, what is a great set of values? A great set of values is something that, if followed perfectly,
Mm.
would manifest your vision.
Mhm.
And turns out that those four values weren't very good in retrospect. Okay, so why weren't they good? Well, the first thing
Right.
is they weren't clear enough.
Mm.
It wasn't super clear what those meant. They weren't easy to remember, and they didn't have the entirety of what we needed. They weren't
Mhm.
a complete and comprehensive set of instructional behavioral values and kind of ideology that was going to manifest our vision. But what's even more is the values are the top of your kind of thought leadership hierarchy. And um, maybe I just say a word about how we came up
Mhm.
with this because I think it's people are like, I don't know how to come up with values.
Mhm.
And the way we came up with it, it was a tactic that Vern had in the book Rockefeller's Habits. And the tactic was something he called the life raft exercise. And the life raft exercise was like you brainstorm the best employees you ever had, and you imagine you're in the life raft. Who would you want in your life raft if you were
Mhm.
stuck?
Yeah.
And then you did that exercise, which usually ended up like your founders and like a handful of other people who you really liked. And then you were supposed to brainstorm all the attributes of all those people. Then you were supposed to kind of look for commonalities and circles. And inside those circles, you would kind of create, well, what's the same here?
Mhm.
And we uh, we kind of came up with have a sense of humor. Now, I like humor a lot still to this day.
Mhm.
I think levity is really important. I think optimism is really important. But when humor is at the top of the hierarchy, it permits things. And
Mhm.
that was what I didn't understand. And so one of the things that manifested in our organization was this thing, which was a rubber chicken. It was just a,
Uh-huh.
it was a rubber chicken,
Classic rubber chicken comedic prop. Yeah.
comedic prop. Exactly. And, the way we first came up with it, by the way, was I was part of a peer group, and we used to at the end of our two-day meeting, we would do this thing called the Great Idea Contest. And there was a member of the peer group that mailed it in every time. And it was like really bothering Josh and I that they were mailing it in. They were coming up with the horrible ideas. And so we brought the rubber chicken to the peer group meeting. It's kind of like a
Mm.
joke. It says, if you lose, like we're going to choose 1 and 2 and 3, but we're also going to choose 10. And if you get 10, you get the rubber chicken because like we were tired of non-competitive
Mhm.
ideas. By the way, you threw in $50. There was a reward for the, $100 each. And it was
Uh,
like, you had to buy drinks. So it wasn't really a reward. But anyhow, so that's how we came up with it. It was like a rubber chicken to disincentivize bad behavior. And it was funny and everybody laughed about it. And we thought, hey, maybe we should do this internally.
mm.
This is a bad idea, by the way. Don't do rubber chicken on your team. I'm telling you this, to not do it. So we manifested this thing when one of our team members made a mistake, the rubber chicken would like end up hanging on their cubicle.
Ah, yeah.
Okay. So we thought it was in good fun. We thought it was like a fun way to disincentivize bad behavior. We thought it was funny. In 20, what was it? It was 2009. I joined the executive MBA program at the High School of Business at UC Berkeley. And at the time they
Mhm.
did a program with Columbia Business School. And in my second semester, I took operations with a woman named Sarah Beckman.
I know
She was,
her, by the way.
well,
She
you might be,
she was a guest professor at MIT when I was, studying operations and management there.
yeah, she's great.
Yeah.
I love her. But she was the one who introduced me, by the way, to kind of Edwards Deming and some of
Mhm.
the lean stuff. So that was where I got on some of the lean philosophy, and I started
Yeah.
reading some of these things. And one day I was on a sales call with our sales leader at the time, and something had happened, and people were mad at him, and he said something to me kind of like, one thing I hate about this organization is that it feels like we're always trying to figure out who to blame. Just like it like that
Yeah.
hit me like a bricks, and I kind of realized I'm like, yeah, we kind of do that. Like we justify it in that we're trying to problem
Mm.
solve,
Yeah.
but after reading Deming's, like it's impossible to read Deming. If you have read Deming's, then you know where I'm going with it. You can
I
you can imagine the story. If you haven't
yeah,
read Deming's,
I do. Yeah, I know where you're going, but
yeah,
yeah. I recommend to the listener, if they haven't read W. Edwards Deming, do check out his body of work.
yeah, yeah, Edwards Deming. So he came up with 14 points of management. Point
Mhm.
8 is something that everybody should know. It's drive fear out of the workplace.
Yeah.
So Edwards Deming figured out in the 40s or 50s how critical this was for leaders, and what he determined was that leaders need to be able to see error. If they can't see error, if they can't see problems in their organization, then they
Mhm.
can't apply any problem solving techniques to fix them.
Right.
And when workers are afraid of being blamed, rubber
Mhm.
chicken,
Yeah.
when they're afraid of getting a rubber chicken, then even though that might seem small, that shame and reputational
Mhm.
risk will cause them to hide problems from leaders.
Right.
It's a cultural no-no if you want to be
Mhm.
good. If you want to be a great organization and you have people who are afraid of retaliation and retribution towards them and non-straightforward action from their leaders, then you're going to leave a lot of high performance on
Mhm.
the team.
Yeah, absolutely.
It started to click for me that we had elevated humor in the wrong spot of the hierarchy. So in
Yeah.
other words, humor needs to be subordinated to something. It's okay. It's even great so long as it's subordinated to another idea, another principle.
Mhm.
And that principle, as you probably know, is respect. And
Sure.
Deming went to Japan and worked for Toyota, and Toyota, one of their core values is respect for people.
Right.
So
And
now,
and and they, even in recent years, give credit to Dr. Deming, even though he passed away more than 30 years ago.
yes, and so okay, so there's a couple things to break down here from the story for me. So the first one was at the time I had this look, it was really, really hard to invent those values. They don't
Mhm.
sound that interesting, but like the number of meetings and debates that we had and the confusion that it was like an impossible task to come up with those things with my 3 really opinionated co-founders. So it was impossible to come up with them, but we did. and it was even harder to, to get alignment on them. And then we had to put all of our reputation capital with everybody we hired constantly to try to rally commitment around these things. So there's a very well documented bias called the escalation of commitment. So if you've put your reputation on something, it's very difficult for you to want to reverse course. We even
Ah,
wrote politicians for this. We call them flip floppers.
right.
Just if you're out there listening, changing your mind is a very noble act. It's brave, it's courageous. If you have better information and you change your mind, you're actually, like in my view, you're
Yeah.
that's something to be celebrated for as a leader, because there's nothing worse than being stubborn and hubris about
Yeah.
your ideas.
Well, I agree, like, especially in business, that's a sign of strength and confidence to say, "I've gotten more data, I've learned something, I tried something, it didn't work, and I've learned and I've adjusted." I've had 2 active sitting members of Congress on the show, going back to episode 1, Will Hurd, and forget the episode number, but Adam Smith from Washington, who's still in Congress, and I talked with both of them about, yeah, like, it's a shame, but the voters do seem to punish you, or the political pundits well, yeah, label someone a flip flopper, and it's hard to even admit a mistake as a politician. I'm glad they did.
It's one thing if you just betray solid principles to be
Right.
a populist. I think that's the problem. But if you've really become educated and you're changing your mind because of new data or the world
Mhm.
has taught you something, I think it's noble.
I
Okay,
agree.
I want to go back and reference Jim Collins, because I think Jim Collins did something bad for the bit. I idolize the guy. I've read every single one of his books, and I think all his ideas are fantastic for the most part. But he had this one line in in Built to Last. It was something like, it wasn't exactly, but it was something like, value should last the lifetime of a leader.
Mhm.
So you're already so psychologically biased to keep your values because they're hard to do, that you don't want to change them. You really, really don't. And then especially if you're permitted by somebody like Collins, who, is this like godlike thought leader in the business community, who's like, oh, don't change them. So I'm on a campaign to get people to realize, like, your values probably suck. Maybe that's too, but there's probably a lot of work. They're probably not easy to remember. They're probably not very
Sure.
clear. They probably don't encompass all the philosophy you need. So for me, when I realized that the values were wrong, it was like, oh, w- wh- like, how am I gonna? It felt like an impossible thing to take on this challenge, but I had a lot of conviction that it needed to be rectified. And so, um, the favorite mistake, so to speak, is I got the values wrong. And what I want to just share with your audience mostly is, like, you only have two kind of levers as the CEO. I mean, it's a complicated to be a CEO, but I think it's
Yeah.
easiest to understand it if you distill it down to your business strategy, which is essentially your vision, and the philosophical beliefs that make up the identity of your team members, your culture. And if your values are off the table, you're competing as a CEO with one arm totally tied behind your back.
Yeah.
And so, like, well, how do you know if your values are right or wrong? It's actually pretty easy. Are you manifesting your vision at the pace that you think you should? Because if you are, then you should keep your values the same. But if you're not making traction towards your vision appropriately, then you have to go back and look, well, what is the problem? And then there's a very simple question. It's, look, if everybody just did these values perfectly, then would all of our problems go away? And if the answer is yes, then you have got an operational issue with managing your culture. But if no, like, if everybody did this stuff, we're not innovative
Mhm.
enough, or we're not doing these things well enough. It's like, well, then they're not then the behavior philosophy is not encompassed appropriately in your values. Your values probably need to be wider. They need to include
Mhm.
more things, or they need to
Yeah.
disinclude certain things that you permit now that are actually in your way, such as hanging rubber chickens
Yes.
on people's
Oh,
cubicles. So you've got to stop permitting things that are getting in your way, and you've got to cultivate the appropriate behavioral norms or
mhm.
philosophical ideas that are necessary to manifest your strategy.
Sure.
And so maybe that will give you something to sink your
Yeah.
teeth into for follow-up.
Yeah. Um, I mean, there's a lot that we could dig into there. I mean, one thing I hear you either saying or even raising the question of, is it worth hours and hours and meetings and meetings. I mean, especially in the early stages of a startup, is that the best use of the CEO's time and the team's time? I'm not saying values aren't important, but the discussion and trying to hammer out like what are the company values as opposed to everyone just sharing like one of my values would be I think it's counterproductive and awful to blame individuals for systemic mistakes. Like I might be presented with data that says it's actually helpful to blame people. I don't think that's likely. Like to me, that's a very deep-seated value. But yeah, I don't know if that would be a shared value at a company I was starting with other people. You know, like I guess what I threw a lot at you there. It wasn't
Yeah,
even a
well,
question.
life is hard, and we have a hard time with gray. We have a hard people. I'm saying I'm included in this. Have
Yeah.
a hard time with high fidelity thinking. We want to lo-fi everything so that we can interact with it. The reality is something like this. As a human being, if you're suffocating, you're not really worried about your next meal. And if you're not suffocating, but you're really hungry, you're not thinking about much except your next meal.
Right.
But if you have air and you have food, then you're probably just thinking about shelter. And if you get that too, you might be thinking about relationships. And if you get that too, you might be thinking about self-actualization. That's Maslow's
Mhm.
hierarchy,
Right.
if you've
Exactly.
never heard that.
Yeah.
And businesses operate a little bit the same. Like if you don't have a customer and you don't have any employees, if it's just
Right.
you and your co-founder trying to get something done, you're pretty low on the hierarchy. So
Right.
you're not thinking about community building and you're not thinking about becoming the best version of yourself yet. And that I think that's
Sure.
okay. And it's not necessarily always linear because you're in these phases where, okay, now the next bottleneck we need to solve is some kind of we need some level of culture. And so you might get culture just well enough to get to the next milestone. And then you figure out like, yeah, we didn't get it all right. And we got to go back and start thinking about culture. But it's culture and strategy.
Mhm.
I think in an early, very, very early business, a startup, for example, you're really focused on trying to come up with the go to market, the product fit, what the strategy is going to be, what the vision's going to be. You're in search for that. So you're
Mhm.
not really managing a big team. You've got a small team, usually hand selected, usually highly committed to sorting it out, usually equity stakeholders. So it's not culture building isn't quite as important in that early stage. But
Sure.
as soon as the business becomes operational to some
Mhm.
degree, and you're going to bring a bunch of others in, it becomes pretty darn important pretty quick at that point. Yeah, so you have to figure out where you're at and what's the next bottleneck, and that requires discernment
Uh-huh.
basically, and that's something that's developed over time.
Yeah, and it might be to borrow a different phrase from Jim Collins, a different book title, that focusing on values once you're no longer in survival mode, that helps you go from good to great.
Right. Yeah, or yeah, or accelerate growth and that type of stuff. But
Yeah.
the encouragement is, you have a problem. You want to go somewhere, you're not getting there, and there's one or two reasons why. Either your strategy isn't particularly good, and that would be, you could think of that as something like what we're doing is invaluable enough to the marketplace for them to reward us with the kind of growth and profits that we want. We have to change
Mhm.
the nature of what we're delivering to the marketplace such that it creates more value to the marketplace, that it manifests the growth and the profit margins that we desire. That could be, we need to do this more efficiently so we can charge less. That will draw people in. Or we need to do something more or different or solve the problem in a more unique and differentiated way such that we find our home. And that's a strategic problem. And then the cultural issue would be like, I'm having a hard time getting our team to like lock in and do the necessary things that, they're not motivated. Like we have people who are quitting too early, or they're doing these wrong things, or they won't put the documentation in the system. Like I don't know how many times I heard that in my career. It's like they're not doing their timesheets. It's like we have a cultural issue at that point in time. Like they don't care about what the business needs them to care about in order for them to be successful. And you haven't cultivated the appropriate emotional connections to the activities necessary to win. And that's a cultural element.
Yeah. So, yeah, can you give an example, nowadays, other than not using the rubber chicken? I mean, how would you or others in your company react to a mistake today? Like, do you have an example? that you could walk us through, or even talk conceptually around like the steps you would take as a leader if you discover a mistake, or if someone feels safe to come and talk to you and say, "Hey, Mike, here's this mistake that I or a team made." How
I
do you put that
I
away from?
love it. I love it so much. So this question, the we don't call them mistakes. We call them problems. There's semantics are sometimes more important than not, but a mistake kind of has an implication that somebody did something wrong. A problem leaves room for we don't actually pretend to know why the problem is happening.
Well, and in some organizations, they don't. I run into this a lot. They don't even like to say problem, because to them that seems to imply this blame and punishment response. So they'll say like, "Can we call them opportunities?" But I mean, I think regardless of the language, like the language might feel dangerous if people are being punished.
Right. So yeah, right. But we call them problems, and what we do is we have these things called problem registers. So we have a system that captures all of the mistakes or problems or
Mhm.
things that didn't go the way that we hoped they'd go. So you can think of it as like we have an idea of how things should go. And when they don't go the way that we think that they should go, they show up on, they get logged
Uh-huh.
in this thing called a problem register.
Yeah.
So the idea is to cultivate the kind of beliefs and norms that when things go wrong, that they get reported through a chain of command and end up on a problem register. What do you do with the problem register? Okay, so then there's another piece of infrastructure that lays on top, which is we have kind of a rhythm. So there's some roles, by the way, which are useful to understand, and then there's some rhythms. So let me talk about the roles and rhythms. We have a role called a value stream manager.
Mhm.
So at Endsight, we have 5 service delivery pods that serve 5 different groups of clients. So we have like a legal pod that only does law firms. We have a wine industry pod that's like in Napa Valley. They do all wine industry. We have 3 commercial pods that have a mix of customers inside those pods and are mostly geographically focused. One's kind of San Diego and Orange County, and 2 are here in the Bay Area.
Mhm.
And but you can imagine that the pods have a bunch of roles. So for example, inside of a pod, we have a help desk. So we have a position called a help desk value stream manager
Mhm.
that manages that function across all the pods to make sure that there's uniformity, and that that we
Mhm.
can manage consistency across all 5 service delivery pods.
It's a
And
cross-functional type
yes,
role, or
why is that role important? Well, because if there are problems in the help desk, there's an owner that can review those problems and try to sort out what's going on. They know the role really well. They're not the help desk
mm,
man. Each pod has their own help desk manager, by the way. So they're not the
yeah.
help desk. They don't manage the employee. They manage the
I
process.
so I made a mistake. I meant to call that, like, it's like a matrix organization.
It's exactly what that's
Mm.
exactly. And you can actually find this if you've what is it in lean thinking? I think is where we was that James Womack or
That's Womack and
yeah,
Jones. Uh-huh.
it was the first one that introduced us to the concept of a matrix. And so we added some of these roles in where we had a lot of repeat work, so that the problem register would roll up to there, and they could run an A3 or a some kind of problem solving structural problem solving idea against these problems. And they could also sort through the problems in terms of their frequency and impact, so that we could say, this problem happens, but it's very low impact and it doesn't happen very often. It's like, okay, we're going to let that fire burn. It might show up again because we're not solving it. But these problems are high frequency and high impact. So we're going to prioritize these ones.
Mhm.
And that's how we manage it. Now there's a, there's rhythms too. So I'm going to get to that in a second, but let me just talk about letting fires burn. So one of the things that happens is if an employee raises their hand and says, "Hey, I have a problem,"
Mhm.
and you don't work on it, one thing that you have to worry about is that employee can get really frustrated the next time. I told you this problem happened
Right.
and nobody did anything about it, and they get
Mhm.
really frustrated.
Right.
One of the things that having problem registers and showing what you're working on is so that when people see those problems occur again, they don't get super frustrated. They know they just record it again. They know that if it happens enough, then the frequency and impact is going to start escalating and it'll eventually get worked on. But
Um,
they don't have, there's disclosure as to what you're working on and what you're not working on. And so people can kind of, they can operate with some level of frustration knowing that, okay, there's some sanity to
w
how we're dealing with this stuff.
what I hear you saying though is that people would hopefully not feel ignored, but recognize that, well, hey, we've got to do some prioritization. Some.
Yes, that's exactly right. Because
Mhm.
otherwise, that people think, "Hey, I notified just like you asked me to that there's a problem,
Yeah.
and nobody did anything with it, so why do I even bother?" And then they
Yeah.
get really frustrated, and then they give up, and then what you wanna do is have a great two-way communication. You communicate with us the problems, we're gonna communicate back to you what we're working on and why,
Mhm.
and you keep communicating the problems because that might escalate its priority.
Yeah.
So that's roles, and so roles really matter, and it's not obviously the value stream manager without the visibility into from the people who are doing the job is going to be very ineffective. So
Mhm.
they've got to have the people who are doing the job collaborating constantly with what's going on the boots on the ground. Then there's an act of rhythm. So in lean, I think they call this kaikaku. No, that's not it.
Well,
It's
Ka Kaikaku, I only know
yeah,
like 10 Japanese words. That's like radical
yeah,
improvement.
that's
But
like when you break down the whole when you just like take down the whole inventory shelf. There's
right.
a what's their annual planning word? For some reason
Well,
the
Hoshin
Hoshin
kanri
Kanri, that's it.
or
So
strategy deployment. Yeah.
so we don't we've kind of taken kind of the best of, like the one-page business plan or the
Mm.
EOS structure. We've layered this kind of some lean principles on it. So what we do at Endsight from a vision building perspective is, you kind of start with this big, hairy, audacious goal to use a Jim Collins idea. It was like, what are we trying to build in 10 years? What are we trying to become in 10 years? Then you say, well, if we were on perfect track to that, where would we be in 5? Okay, so the line has to go through the big, hairy, audacious goal, 5-year goals. It's like, okay, if we were gonna get to our 5-year goals, where would we have to be next year? And then you'd have to be like, okay, to get to that 1-year spot, like, what problems would we have to solve quarter by quarter to roadmap our way into the next 1 year?
Yeah.
So that's the first part of kind of vision setting and business planning. But then we're using this Hoshin Connery process, which is it goes down and then it goes up and down. So you've got to cascade this business plan down to the front line, and they meanwhile have to cascade up to you what they're seeing from the front lines as the most important problems. And then you have this process where you start selecting what you're really going to work on and how you're going to work on it and what are the
Yeah.
time. So not everything is done on an A3. Some things are assigned out on a quarter by quarter basis using like something like priorities and rocks. So
Mhm.
it's like, okay, we're going to build this thing this quarter and this person is going to do it,
Yeah.
and they're going to have it done by the end of the quarter because we think it's sized right such that they could do that. So you have an A3 would be something where the problem is, let's say, we don't really understand the solution very well yet. We
Mhm.
just understand it's a problem. Somebody's got to really go understand it really well. We've got to come up with measurements. We've got to like
Well, and you do some root cause analysis. So it's
go to
not.
the Gemba, watch, talk to customers, talk to employees. So it's like we know it's a problem. We just don't really
Yeah.
know when we're talking about quarterly priorities. It's like we know it's a problem. We actually have a really good idea how to solve. We already selected the tool. We got to implement the tool. There's going to be training. That makes its way. That's a rhythm thing. That makes its way
Mhm.
into a quarterly priority and so on and so forth. So you're using kind of a combination of rhythms for certain problems, and you're using a combination of problem solving methodologies, and then you're using a combination of business planning. One's more of an annual rhythm one, and one's this kind of idea of the Hoshin Connery where you're cascading down and cascading up. So you have this up down vertical communication with your organization such that everybody's aligned.
Mhm.
A lot of work, but it's like it is the job. It's also, by the way, what makes the job fun because um, if people are working, there's a parable of a guy who walks past this worker and says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I'm laying bricks." And then he
Yeah.
moves on to the next guy and he says, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I'm laying bricks." He goes to the third guy. He says, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I'm building a cathedral."
Yeah. There's
And
vision and purpose and.
it, just that subtle change is the difference when people are
Mhm.
working on the problems and they become cathedral builders. They're a part of the process of becoming rather than just a cog in a system that they feel frustrated by. And you want
Right.
you want to try to include your team in the process of becoming. And that's the kind of one of the what makes it fun to work for a company who's visionary, who has a good vision and who's communicating it down and it's going up.
Yeah. And you described that process of strategy deployment. It's not simply a top down goal deployment of telling people what the priorities are, what the measures are. Like that could be very top down, and that would be called maybe just goal deployment. But that more Japanese style, lean management style, strategy deployment is both top down and bottom up. And,
Yes.
there's back and forth and there's input and collaboration.
One thing I did talk about, and if my business partner were here, he'd be like jumping in because it's also horizontal. And you might think, what do you
Yes.
mean horizontal? Well, it's
Yep. You're right.
like you might have a problem in your organization, but it requires another a horizontal person to solve a problem for you. Because, like, let's say you're finance and your biggest problem is collections, but the root cause, is actually that people's documentation that's making its way to the billing is terrible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It,
So go fix
and
that.
so every time they go to collect, it's because it's super confusing the bill, and they don't know how to put the documentation and the time any better. So now you've got this horizontal chain problem that needs alignment. In order for the finance team to solve their collections issue, the pro services team needs to solve their documentation issue. So there's this horizontal communication that has to occur and align as well. Otherwise, you just got people frustrated again. I can't solve my own problem. So that's the Hoshin kanri process, is to gain up down alignment, horizontal alignment, so everybody knows where we're going, and we're all working on things that are balancing each other, so that we're all set up to win.
Yeah.
And that's the job of management, and
Hmm.
it's not an easy job, but it is the job.
Yeah. So maybe one final question for you, Mike. You mentioned again W. Edwards Deming, um, and one of the things he advocated for that I know you talk about and you've referenced or you've alluded to is moving away from what you might call command and control management, which is that style of the leader has the answers, the leader barks orders, the workers just say aye and execute. But could you share your thoughts on how that kind of style not only kills creativity but that sense of ownership in a team?
Well, maybe I'll say it differently.
Okay.
I feel like I say this on a whole bunch of podcasts, so anybody who's following is probably super tired of hearing it, but it's actually essential to know. So your job as a leader, I kind of talked about strategy and culture, but there's a thread there, which is it's motive. So
Hmm.
you really have to think about the motive of your team members.
Yeah.
And we're at a day and age where we understand this now at a scientific level. So there's a book called Prime to Perform. The authors are Doshi and McGregor. It's an
Hmm.
interesting book. People can read it. They could get the cliff notes by going to ChatGPT and just getting the highlight points. But what's essential for them to understand is that motive is could be a derivative of the work. So in other words, if I love the work, that's there's kind of no derivative. I'm motivated
Hmm.
because I get joy from doing the work.
Yeah.
Okay. The first derivative of it is called purpose. It's like, I may like the work okay, or
Mhm.
maybe I don't, but I
Yeah.
really believe in its impact. And the third derivative of the work is potential. It's like, like it would be example of somebody who's working as a law clerk because they want to become a lawyer. Maybe they don't even care about the
Wow.
law firm's mission so much. Maybe the
Mhm.
the law clerk isn't it that well, but they see it as a stepping stone. Okay, those are 1, 2, 3.
Mhm.
Once you get to the fourth derivative, performance starts to fall off a cliff. The first three, by the way, are correlated to high performance. Once
Mhm.
you get to these third and fourth and fifth derivatives, the performance goes in the tank. And this is
Yeah.
well documented, well studied. The first, the next one is economic pressure. So when
Mm.
people are working for money,
Yeah.
you can almost guarantee that their performance is going to suffer. They will do it though, because
Yeah.
they need money. So they'll still work, but they're going to be in a low performance land.
Mm.
The derivative even below money is emotional pressure. And
Um,
if people are working because they're afraid, this is fear. If they're
mm.
afraid of consequence, they're afraid of a human, somebody yelling at them or whatever, their performance
Right.
even worse. And the last one, they don't even remember why they're motivated. It's called inertia. They're doing it
Mhm.
because they did it yesterday and they've
Yeah.
lost track of why they're even doing any of this stuff.
Yeah.
So you, as a leader, you need to manage that. So when you're barking orders at people, what are you doing? That's emotional pressure.
Yeah.
The you're not motivating people for, well, you're not making it play for them. We can
Mhm.
talk about what makes it play. and you're not providing them a purpose, so you're not explaining to them what the impact is going to be and why things are going to be better if they and you're not connecting to their self-actualization, their purpose, their individual purpose, like, hey, if you take on this challenge you're going to become better. You're strictly being like, if you don't do it I'm going to yell. Like, there,
Yeah.
it's not
Or
a
threatening
theory.
to fire them, which takes away there's the economic pressure combined with it, right?
It's not a theory, by the way.
Mhm.
The data is undeniable. The only reason I think you should go read Prime to Perform is if you can't take this for faith and you need to go listen
Yeah,
to these guys' research to understand it. But the point is, it's not theory. It's not my idea.
sure.
It's very well researched. So Deming knew this
Mhm.
with his point eight. He knew it before the research. It was intuitive to him, but now we have data. So
Yeah,
I just think that's a really, really poor way of trying to motivate a workforce.
right.
Another way that I've used to describe this in the past, and I think this is really helpful. I already mentioned it once. Is that puts your team in the limbic system. That's
Mhm.
like the fear and stress response.
Yeah.
Okay, they become prey animals. They adopt the animating spirit of a prey animal.
Yeah,
So
that's
with
the amygdala, the
yeah,
the
it,
reptile brain.
and it could. By the way, that amygdala grows. It starts consuming a bunch of brain space. So
Oh, I
like,
didn't know that.
yeah, no, like it's this little tiny center, but once it
Yeah.
starts going off, it captures the whole brain. You stop being able to think really clearly when your amygdala is going on because
Yes.
you're using it. So, but here's another way I illustrate this. I created the video on my channel talking about this, but I think lions and zebras are a great way of describing this. So I did this with my team. You know, when a pride of lions attacks a zebra, they don't just go and like randomly attack the herd. They actually communicate which zebra they're going to go after, and then they carve that zebra out of the crowd. It's deliberate, it's coordinated,
Mhm.
they're a team, they're in predator animal land. That's where you
Yeah.
want your team. When prey animals get attacked, they go crazy. It's the herd go they're trying to do is confuse the lions. When a beehive gets kicked, it goes crazy. When you put your team into when you put your team into prey animal land,
Yeah.
you're cultivating chaos. You're
Mhm.
destroying coordination. You're moving people from the dopaminergic system, which is a feel good chemistry. It makes it work play, and you're
Mhm.
putting them into limbic land. And it's not good for, well, first of all, it's not good for people's well being,
Right.
but your performance is going to really, really suffer
Mm.
too.
Yeah.
So it's unnecessary. It's no place you want to work. It's no place and it's just very immature leadership. It's your
Right.
limbic system, and you're trying to like
Yeah.
spread it to your team. It's like,
Yeah.
if you're nervous and go meditate, don't go start yelling at your team. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
you're nervous about your goals as a leader. You're afraid. It's like, well, you've got individual problems you got to sort out, but you can't solve your problem by coming to your team with your hair on fire.
Yeah.
You've got to go get your stuff together. It's like when we don't hit goals at Endsight or whatever, the first thing we have to do is like, we've been here before. We
Mhm.
paid a lot. We paid some price for this wisdom. Let's not let's not
Yeah.
abandon it. It's
Yeah.
not the first time. It's not going to be the last time we made a mistake or we didn't hit our goals.
Yeah.
So let's figure out what to do about it thoughtfully and carefully, like a pride of lions going after a very specific target. Let's not get into limbic land here.
Yeah.
And so that's what people want from their leader. They need a calm, steady state
Yeah.
and bring everybody back together and point everybody back towards the target.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thank you for, sharing a lot of your insights, not just from your reading, but from your hard fought learning in practice and different companies and experiences in leading people. So I really appreciate you sharing so much with us today. Our guest again, Mike Chaput. Check out the show notes for a link to his LinkedIn profile, to his website. I'll make sure there's links to some of the great books and authors that you mentioned here today, Mike.
Mark, may I make a quick plug to your audience?
Please do.
I'm launching a podcast, and if you're interested in any of these ideas, you can find me at mikechaput.net. All right, and that'll lead you to subscribe to the podcast. I'm having guests on. We talk about ideas, philosophies. These are senior leaders that aren't anywhere else on the internet. They're people who I've made friends with over a career. So if you like this podcast, you might like mine. And it's
Mhm.
my goal is simply to share great ideas with people who are interested in them. And the
Yeah.
other plug I wanted to make here is if you've made it all the way to the end of this video and you haven't liked and subscribed, commented or shared to Mark, like it's distasteful as a thought leader or somebody who's out here making podcasts to constantly ask everybody for the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
But whenever I guest, I like to make this plug because we don't really get paid for this. We're doing this for you, the audience member. It's kind of it's a passion project. We believe in this ideas. We think the world's going to be better if people get good at leadership and go out there and win. So if you thought this was good and you haven't already done this, like and subscribe to Mark's podcast, and that would be super helpful. The internet works on crowdsourcing. So
Yeah.
if you could crowdsource and get the good content from the bad
Yeah.
content, we're doing a lot of other people a really big service with that.
Thanks.
And you can be a part of that. So
Well, thank you. Yeah, I forgot. Please rate and review. As they say, yeah, neither of us are doing the podcast today out of economic fear. It was more in that striving for learning and self actualization. So, Mike, thank you. I look forward to listening to your podcast. Really enjoyed what you had to share, and I look forward to the kind of guests that you're going to be able to put together on that show. Really appreciate you being here.
yeah, thanks, Mark. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for the time and attention again to your audience, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thanks.